It was a dark and quiet night at Washington Ridge, but little did Shannon and Chris know that their peaceful evening would be interrupted. Eric Boyd arrived at the parking lot with his accomplices, Lamarcus Davidson and Latalvis Cobbins. As soon as Eric and Lamarcus stepped out of their car, leaving Latalvis behind, they were ready to execute their plans to carjack the couple. However, just as they were approaching the couple with guns drawn, the headlights of another vehicle suddenly turned on and caught them off guard. In a frenzy, they pushed Shannon and Chris into the SUV and sped off into the night. After overpowering the couple, the small crew hastily secured them in the back of Shannon's SUV, using whatever cords they could find to bind them tightly. With Lamarcus at the wheel of the SUV and Latalvis following closely behind in a car borrowed from Eric's cousin, the group made their way back to Lamarcus's home on Shipman Street. Once back at the residence with the kidnapped couple, an argument erupted between the five assailants, particularly between George Thomas and Lamarcus, who were mostly unknown to each other and had pre-existing hostility. According to Vanessa Coleman, Lamarcus told Thomas that he was gonna need him to do something so he could trust him.
To gain Shannon's cooperation and buy more time, they dangled the promise of freedom in front of her. Made her believe she could and would be free to go, but only if she agreed to their demands. Shannon made a call to her parents, creating a false alibi to ensure that nobody would be the wiser. After this, Lamarcus, Latalvis, Eric, and George put Chris into the back of the 4Runner and left Shannon behind with Vanessa. It was unclear who had assaulted Chris or at what point this occurred, but forensic evidence showed he had been SA'd. Eric had long been suspected of being the perpetrator, as computer forensics had found adult material depicting men found on his phone, but police lacked enough evidence to charge him with it. After the attack, they took Chris from the back of the vehicle near the railroad tracks running along Shipman Street. Chris's mouth gagged and a sweatshirt tied around his neck. Lamarcus forced George to take the first shot, hitting Chris in the neck. As he fell, he was shot again in the back. As Chris lay on the tracks paralyzed, Lamarcus came up and pressed the gun to his head and pulled the trigger, killing him instantly.
While Shannon lay tied up in a bedroom, unaware of her boyfriend's fate, George and Lamarcus removed their bloody clothes. After changing, they gathered up a comforter and a gas can and returned to the scene of the crime. They wrapped his lifeless body in the comforter, soaked it in gasoline, and then set his body ablaze. While the two were attempting to cover up their crime, Latalvis went into the bedroom where Shannon was being held captive. He then altered Shannon's terms of freedom and told her that she would be free to go in exchange for oral. Shannon was subsequently SA'd so violently and with such force that the membranes in her mouth had been destroyed. It was then Lamarcus's turn, who then proceeded to violently SA her in both the front and the back. The trauma Shannon endured was so severe that it caused blood to pool internally in her privates. They then dragged her into the living room of the residence, where they continued to violate and beat her. As we mentioned earlier, the men forced bleach down her throat in an attempt to destroy any DNA evidence that they left behind. According to Vanessa Coleman, they made me go in the back bedroom. When I come back into the kitchen, I seen them tying her up in the fetal position. After the men had her bound, they proceeded to wrap her body in layers of bags and stuffed her body into a trash can in the kitchen, where forensic evidence later proved that she slowly and painfully asphyxiated to death.
The crime was incredibly gruesome, and unfortunately the victims' families wouldn't experience peace for years to come. Their story also had a profound impact on the community and the nation. Despite investigators refuting claims